Welcome to the Fancy Comma YouTube. Today I'm joined by Dr. Deborah D. Stine, the founder of the Science and Technology Policy Academy, which provides independent consulting, policy analysis, program evaluation, freelance writing, teaching, and coaching services. Previously, she served as the executive director of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in the Obama White House, a science and technology specialist at the Congressional Research Service, a study director at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and a professor of the practice in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. She has a BS in mechanical and environmental engineering, an MBA, and a PhD in public policy analysis and public administration. And actually, Dr. Stine has done much more stuff than this. Like, she's written a book about science policy, and she runs, well, we already said she runs Science and Technology Policy Academy, and she is a fellow of AAAS, which every time I try to spell out what the acronym is, I get it wrong. But so,
American Association for the Advancement of Science.
yeah. So you're a very distinguished person in science policy, and I actually applied to the internship to interned in the White House, in the Obama White House, and I got a couple of interviews. I never interviewed with you, but I did interview with PCAST, and I thought it was really interesting that you could that graduate students in Washington D.C. could intern there. But I didn't get the internship for like a bunch of reasons. But I did end up interning in Congress later. So but yeah, I took it. I was very much plugged into the science policy, Obama, I guess you could say, science policy scene, because that's who was president for the most of the time I was living in Washington as a graduate student. So it's very rare for scientists to take this path into policy. So I'm always interested in meeting people that did this. And obviously you have basically dedicated your whole life to this, I guess. So how did you get into policy as a scientist?
Well, I'll say I did it primarily as an engineer because I consider myself more of an engineer than a scientist, so I am both. Finally, because my bachelor's degree is in engineering, and uh, because I was a field engineer for the first 5 years of my career, I'm always fundamentally as an engineer, but in the world of science technology, I'm dominated by the scientists who far outnumber the engineers who are in science and technology policy. So, I first. I think, even if you go back to the days when I was in high school, I was had a National Science Foundation, one of these, at that time, they called them summer student science training programs. And the study I did as a high school student was looking at microbial degradation of oil, which is basically if you have an oil spill and you have little microbes who would eat the oil. And this is in Texas, and University of Texas at San Antonio, which is where my family's from. And that sort of kind of sparked my interest in science and technology policy because, you want to do the research. Okay, here, and, my research was successful enough that, I could sort of see that how microbes could clean up the oil, but then what happens next? I mean, is it just like it just kind of sits in a laboratory and you put a paper in some journal and then nothing ever happens? And I think it was kind of even at that very early stage that I became interested in public policy. And because my engineering degree is in mechanical and environmental engineering, and I focused on air pollution, I did actually learn about public policy in engineering school. Because there's the Clean Air Act, there's lots of different acts. So so I went from there to uh after that was the University of California. Then I went back to Texas where my family is. And then uh I did two things, which is I worked for the state of Texas, like I said, as a field engineer working on air pollution control for the state air pollution agency. I was basically doing regulation. And then but I volunteered also with an organization, the League of Women Voters. And the nice thing about the League of Women Voters versus like other organizations is that it's very bottom up. So the way they develop positions on issues is by having background documents, having discussions among small groups of women at local leagues throughout the United States. And then all that opinion goes up to headquarters, and that's how they develop positions. So most of the organizations, like if you take something like, say, the National Resources Defense Council or things like that, they do top-down policy development. Now, here's what the experts and so forth say. But during that time, I became quite involved with them, as initially just a member. Then I became president of a local league in Corpus Christi, Texas, and then I went on the state board of directors in Texas. And this is all when I was in my 20s. And I became really interested in public policy. I came to DC every couple of years for the annual meeting of the League of Women Voters. And I sort of kind of got what they call Potomac fever. And subsequently, I decided to move to DC. And I worked full time, and then I worked on my PhD at night at American University. And that's where I began to really focus on science, technology, policy analysis. My dissertation was actually looking at the impact of scientific and technical information on international environmental decision making. So things like climate change or the Montreal Protocol, related to ozone depletion, trends, boundary hazardous waste movement. That was what my dissertation was on. And at the same time that I was working on my dissertation, I started to work for the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Um, and my very first study was for the Committee on Science, Engineering, and Public Policy, and that was on mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. And that was, like I said, I was probably about that point in my like late 20s, maybe early 30s. And that's sort of how my career started.
So then kind of, so I actually also participated in League of Women Voters events as a kid, and I think that was really formative to my political involvement because I used to go door to door for women that were running for office here in Oklahoma. And it's really, I don't know why that I just have so many good memories of like going door to door canvassing and then like attending debates sponsored by the League of Women Voters. I don't know if they're as active now as they were back then, but I feel like I would say that was the 90s when I was involved with them, and they were very active here in Oklahoma.
Yeah, I think yeah, I still think they're pretty active all over the world. I think the only thing that's changed over time is, they sponsor the national. It used to be that the League of Women Voters presidential debates. It was all done by the league, but over time the political parties took over and things happened. But if you look at the local level, you'll probably find a local league. You can just go back and join them. Where are you in Oklahoma?
I am located in Norman, home of University of Oklahoma.
Mhm. Well, I have that I went to middle school in Norman because my dad was teaching ROTC at the University of Oklahoma. So I know it quite well. And I would suspect that there's probably an active League of Women Voters there. And it's a really good place. Just to show you an example again from Texas, one of the PhD students that I sort of like mentored a bit as she was kind of merging the policy world. She became very similar. She was involved with the political campaign. She was very involved with the League of Women Voters in her town in Houston, Texas. And she subsequently, went on to, get AAAS fellowship. She now actually works for Congress, full time as a regular staff member. So it's, I think, a really good way to like volunteer, get a start, and learn how to look at the pros and cons of policy, which fundamentally is what policy analysis is about. Is just as opposed to advocacy, where you're looking just at one side. With policy analysis, you want to look at both the pros and the cons so that you get a better decision.
Yeah, and there's a lot of policy analysis to be done in the current times. I remember I had just interned in Congress in the beginning of the first Donald Trump administration, and I came back to Oklahoma and I was like doing congressional monitoring, I guess you could say, of like different legislation, trade legislation. And man, this is a great time to be a policy analyst because there's policies coming out every day. I actually can't even keep track of all the different policies that are coming out. And um, one thing I wanted to ask you about is this post I saw from Senator Fetterman's wife, Giselle. I helped elect Senator Fetterman in 2022 in the midterms. And I really look up to his wife, Giselle, and she has a really active Instagram, and she posted that politics is heartbreaking. And I really feel like it, for me as a Democrat, in some ways, it has been heartbreaking. Um, it just feels so true to me. Like there's so much push and pull. Like there'll be a lot of stuff that I like going in one, like on the local level, and then this federal level will be like incomprehensible or other way around. And I just feel like I'm constantly surprised by the will of the people and what we decide for our nation. So you've been in policy and politics for a really long time. What have you learned about the policy world and about affecting change after being in this space for decades? And do you have any advice for surviving in the science policy space across political administrations?
Well, the first thing I would say it's sort of the kind of the challenge of the American political system, where there's always winners, always losers. And part of the reason with the current administration that I'm so sympathetic for all the people who have like lost their jobs is because I didn't like lose my job sort of directly, but when I graduated from engineering school, it was between, the Carter administration was just ending and the Reagan administration was just beginning. And so while the year before everybody in my, class in mechanical engineering, they all had like 2 or 3 job offers. Well, for those of us who are in environmental engineering, because President Reagan was not a big fan of any like environmental and energy issues like President Carter was, the job market sort of like dried up. And I even had at that point, like was very close to an offer to design solar cells for satellites for Hughes. And they basically withdrew the offer because of this sort of change in administration. And I remember, like how disappointed I was at the time because it was really things that I really wanted to do, kind of the intersection of space and renewable energy and so forth. Uh, and so it was a challenge, I would say, for that first year between as a transition between the Carter and the Reagan administration. And it's going to be that same way here between the Biden and the Trump administration. But in the end, I was able to get an engineering job, have a successful career. But that transition time can be very anxious because, like I said, at that point, I was in my early 20s and I really didn't quite understand what was going on um, with such a big shift in policies with President Carter putting, solar panels on the White House and I mean, sorry, President Carter saying, about putting solar panels on the White House and President Reagan saying, hey, no, we don't like this. We're going to take these solar panels off. And it was just such an about face. So the one thing, there's a couple things over time I've sort of learned about sort of Americans in general is um, Americans like change, right? They do like some stability in terms of economic stability, but they always kind of think that they can do a bit better than the previous person who held it. So even though incumbents, do tend to stay in office, every once in a while there will be these big sea changes, and President Obama was an example of one. It was a big change, to go from President Bush to President Obama, and then again from President Obama to who made it through 2 terms, mind you, then to President Trump. And so part of it is just kind of like the way Americans are never quite satisfied. We're always trying to get that sort of golden apple. The other big issue is, and this is something that we have to recognize, is that from the perspective of sort of most Americans, even though we don't think of ourselves as the elite, we really are the elite. Um, and that is because of sort of the education and level that we have. Like it's only, I can't remember exactly number, but I think like particularly for people with PhDs, it's like 1 or 2% of people in the entire country. People with STEM degrees, again, a very, very small percentage. Um, and most people don't necessarily are not that they like the benefits of STEM, or really what I say, it's not that they like the benefits of science. What they really like is the benefits of technology, like the fact that we're able to communicate through mechanisms, like Zoom. So I can, like interact, we can play games. I can play games from my home base here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to my family in Texas. We can play games virtually, things like that, things we could never do before. So that comes into it. But in the end, people are fundamentally worried about that what they call kitchen table issues, economic issues. So uh they're worried about the price of eggs. They really are. I mean, because they don't always have uh like sort of a long-term uh discretionary income. They're just trying to pay the bills from week to week. And when there's a change in the price of gasoline, even the change in the price of eggs or milk or all these day-to-day goods, it really does impact people. If people can't get jobs, the unemployment rate is actually very low, was very low during the Biden administration. I expect it's going to increase during the Trump administration, given all the people he's laying off. And it's not just even the people he lays off directly, but all the people who, like, say, work for the universities and work for, um, so like if I'm somebody who's at, say, I'm giving this example because it shows why there were protests, like the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta is let's say the crown jewel of one of the major health enterprises in the entire world. So when you lay off people from CDC, you're not only losing that knowledge, but those people have, like well-paying jobs, and they use those well-paying jobs to buy houses, buy groceries, go out to eat, go to the movies, spend money in their community. When they lose their jobs, the community loses that income. And so you're going to see economic you know, impacts, not just from those directly, but what's called induced cost, things that are for the communities that sort of surround these areas, the stores and things like that. So, I think that's part of the thing with politics too, is that the issues that are the focus of our day to day are not the focus of the average Americans. Even my sister, who is in Texas, and she's a former federal employee, worked for the court system. She does not like to pay any attention to politics. I mean, it is kind of like off the table. But what she does care about is, does my niece get a job? Is she able to support herself, about her own like income that would come from Social Security and things like that. And those are just not the issues that we in the science technology community tend to talk about. We don't talk about everyday people and their concerns. We tend to be much more focused in this kind of elitist kind of perspective on our own focus, even if that focus is meant for societal good. It's like we're focused on things like, okay, well, we have all these workers from USAID, they're helping people, you know, with hunger and disease and stuff all over the world. But for some people, they're just really focused on their home. They're, they don't necessarily even leave their state or even leave their community. They're just focused on their own needs and that of their communities, and they really don't care about these other things. It's just like, why are my tax dollars going for this? And it's just not the way that at least some of us in the science technology community think. We tend to have this more global view, um, and you know that's a perspective that we bring.
Yeah, I've noticed, and I thought about this a lot in the COVID pandemic when there's this whole narrative. Well, I don't want to say narrative. It's kind of like a battle, sort of, between vaccine scientists. I can name them off. There's like Paul Offit is in a feud with Callie Means. I don't really know who Callie Means is. I really need to dig deep into because there's also Peter Hotez, which I just reviewed his book for the Fancy Comma blog, and he's in a feud with the Children's Defense Fund, which is the group affiliated with RFK Jr., who's now HHS secretary. And it's like there's also like there's a firm called Purple Strategies, and they've been doing a lot of work talking about how people feel about vaccine or how people feel about science and Make America Healthy Again. And actually, people are really excited about Make America Healthy Again. So then it's like, um, when I look at what's happening, I feel like and I read an email today, or I don't know if it was an email, like a fundraising email that someone posted on Reddit, and they were it was like from RFK Jr., I want to say, and it allegedly, and it was like they're trying to make science political. So it's like to some people, science is viewed as just like facts and evidence, and maybe not even facts and evidence, depending on who you ask. To scientists, science is like, well, science is what they do. So obviously they have a lot of like, they put a lot of faith in it. But then when you go to like some average person, or you just ask someone about like vaccines or something, that's like the big, most politicized thing I think is vaccines, with all these like politicians versus lawyers versus scientists. It's like this whole big like feud. People are like, they're more skeptical, I guess you could say, of vaccine science, and they have all these questions about it. And the healthy skepticism I've noticed from when you ask scientists, they don't, that's not their job to explain like these things that are not really scientific but like relate to someone's life. Like if I get a COVID vaccine, like if you ask a scientist, like if the COVID vaccines work, why don't they work? Which is what the GOP Judiciary Committee tweeted out and then deleted. I think a scientist would get mad, but I feel like scientists should be able to just answer those questions. And I think that's something that has been missing. And because it's been missing, we kind of like completely flipped from having a mainstream scientific ecosystem to now we kind of, I want to say we've kind of gone rogue with like the HHS and like everything that's happening there. I never thought in my life that we could have RFK Jr. as the head of HHS. But then when I think about his views, I mean, like, people do not, I guess people don't like the things that RFK is like rallying people around. So then it's like, science isn't, so like, what are your thoughts on this? Like, do you have any, are you able to, I haven't been able to process my thoughts on everything that's been happening. It's been, and it's been very science focused, which is really interesting because I was just telling someone on on one of these interviews, you know, when things get really stressful, logical reasoning goes out the window. And then I feel like that's kind of happened, unless there's, I don't really understand what's going on with the executive branch right now. I'm a legislative branch kind of girl. But what are your thoughts on everything that's happening? Have you been able to process this? You have a lot more perspective as someone that's been through a lot of political changes.
Well, yeah, I think like if you go back to Trump won, right? So part of the reason that Trump, was elected president was because the there was the feeling of some that even though the Obama administration, um, did a good job, it still didn't meet the needs and perspectives of your like average American. Um, and so, but what occurred is that Trump, really did not know what he was doing when he came into office, right? He, as they say, he went down that escalator. It was a big surprise to everybody, even the Republicans, that he made it all the way to the Oval Office. But part of the reason that he did is because of the general distrust in institutions. And so if you kind of look at the data, the trust in actual scientists is still pretty high, pretty stable. But if you look at the trust in academic institutions, it has dropped dramatically. Now, part of it is because in some ways people feel that they got false promises. So the first sort of promise was, okay, well, if you get a college degree, that's what you need to get a job. But then people got college degrees and they didn't get jobs right away. right? Because it's more nuanced than that. If you know, if you get a job in certain fields, it's challenging. Then people said, okay, well, tuition was at one point affordable. So when I went to the University of California, I mean, I think I paid like less than $1,000 for the year because as a California resident, I think I paid $400 a quarter, like I don't know, let's just say $1,200 as a fee. Okay, well, that's affordable. But when I moved to like a private university for my PhD, then I was paying $400 a credit hour, right? And when you look at the tuition at major universities, 50, $60,000 and people taking on student loans to pay for that. And then people say, okay, well, is it, we were given a false promise that if we invested this much money, if we sacrificed, if we sent our kids to college, they would be able to get good jobs, well-paying jobs, and so forth. And it didn't really always turn out to be true for everybody. Um, and that increased the distrust of institutions, like universities. Then there were also, like during the pandemic, the uh, that was also when the distrust of the like HHS, CDC, when that occurred. And part of that was sort of two things, which is not the best communication policies out there. And there have been at the National Academies, there have been studies, workshops, things like that. There's a wonderful person, his name is Brooke Fishoff. He is a professor focused on social decision scientist. He's a member of all three academies, National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, and National Academy of Medicine. And when I was at Carnegie Mellon University, he was one of my like colleagues. And what he talks about, and there's great interviews that he has on YouTube about this, is that because of the need to go for action, like none of these messages were tested, and people just like started communicating without much thought. And so the case I remember the most is masking. Should we wear a mask or not wear a mask? It was very, very confusing during those early days, right? So first it was no, you didn't need to wear a mask. It's only people who were like firefighters and hospital workers that wear fast. So like I remember Meghan McCain on The View, she gave all her masks to the hospital, but then it turned out, oh no, you should wear a mask. And then it was required to wear a mask. And so there's a lot of very confusing messaging. And because of this, confidence decreased. Um, because, when you learn science and math in school, like you pretty much everybody does at sort of the K through 12 level, there's a certain answer, right, to that math problem or to this physics issue or chemistry, whatever. But in real life, it's not that way, right? In real life, there's a lot of uncertainty. In fact, one of the for the department I was in when I was at Carnegie Mellon, the slogan was the only certainty is uncertainty, right? But we don't teach that at the K through 12 level. We don't talk about uncertainty and the fact that science and knowledge changes over time and that will impact the decisions we made. And so you have a lot of people who sort of felt um, betrayed, in some way. And so all of these impact the enterprise. Now, going back to President Trump, there was like two things that occurred. And I think in Trump too, we're seeing some of the payback on this. Now, by the way, not everybody agrees with me on this. In fact, I'm quite active on LinkedIn, and one of the people who I read a lot of his stuff is Holden Thorpe, who's the editor-in-chief of Science. And he put something, says, well, or maybe it was an article that he posted. I don't think it's maybe him personally, like, well, this is, like science is just getting the the blowback, right, of this. I don't think that's true. I think that when President Trump was in office, he did not like the fact that Dr. Fauci contradicted him, you know, that said, oh no, don't use whatever that was, something another quill, whatever it is. Don't do these things. That's not right. Because it wasn't right. He didn't like the fact that there was like Sharpie Gate. Sharpie Gate, if you might remember, was when there was a hurricane map. And NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, said the hurricane was going this way. And President Trump took a Sharpie and said, "Oh no, it's going this way." Right. And actually the scientist that was basically supported President Trump in this, who was, I think, the acting head of maybe of NOAA at the time, he was like, I don't know, convicted or whatever it is of scientific misconduct. But guess who's going to be head of NOAA now in the Trump administration? That same guy, the same guy behind Sharpiegate. And he was a NOAA scientist. So I think some of this is because you know, the Trump administration did not feel because of the pandemic it got to achieve its goals. And then when they did try to do something, the scientific technology community contradicted him because, that's not what we do. We challenge things. And if a fact or a figure or an analysis is wrong, we're going to say something about it. That's just part of what we do. So what occurred in the meantime during Biden is that there was this a well-known conservative think tank, which used to have a relatively decent reputation, which is called the Heritage Foundation. They went and they wrote Project 2025, and it was people who really knew how to make government work. Like Trump did not know how to make government work, but these folks who wrote Project 2025, they really knew how things worked, how to make things happen. And I did for my LinkedIn newsletter, I talked about, okay, here's some of the things that Project 2025 is saying. And if you go back today and you look at Project 25, you'll see that all the things that are in there.
I've read the whole thing, and it's basically that what's happening is, I think what it said, dismantling.
Right.
Actually, there's more. There's more that they haven't done that is in it, but it's
Yeah,
not
I
even
know,
that
but
long.
hey, we're not we just are now 1 month into the Trump administration. I know it's hard to believe it, but it's only been, he was inaugurated on January 20th, and we're recording this on February 21st or something.
21st.
Okay, so we're only 1 month in, and look how much chaos he's created. And typically presidents have had their first 100 days. And the first 100 days, presidents were pretty much allowed to view as a mandate whatever it is that they want to do. And so they had everything in place. So for that first 100 days, you could, create chaos. And just one other kind of thing that to kind of think about is that, like when, Trump had his show, The Apprentice, right? And I did watch The Apprentice the first couple of seasons because I like to watch shows like that where I can maybe learn something, right? And I don't know much about marketing and the things that were the focus of the show. But his slogan was, "You're fired." And Trump just likes to fire people. I mean, that's just kind of like, I don't know, he gets some sort of pleasure out of it. And he did it in his show. And even like the people like who supported him during the show, there was like staff members who'd worked for him for a very long time. When he thought they got too uppity or whatever, um, he fired them. And he just likes firing people. So what's happening now, where he's firing all these people in science and technology with, by the way, 99% of the time, no legal ability to do so, you know, that makes him happy. That's why he is, you'll see him grinning next to Elon Musk. And I don't think that is going to change because that's inherently who he is as a person. He does not get, we
That's
like
what
to,
he's known for, is firing people. I forgot actually that in The Apprentice that was his whole thing, and
right.
even in his first administration, um, he's gotten a
Yeah, his
little
spirit
bit more
is
wise, but he's still
right.
the same Donald Trump that
Yeah.
he's been his whole life, I
His whole
guess.
he himself has not changed. He fired like the CEO of ExxonMobil was the Secretary of State, and he fired him within like a year. The person who is head of the Department of Defense. I mean, he just likes um firing people, and it doesn't take much for him to be willing to do that because he fundamentally does not care about other people, and or the consequences, or like when he fires these workers with no notice, the impact it has on them, their
Well, did
family.
you see? I saw this post. So NIH is currently, I think as we're recording, they're going through the ringer with this. And I saw this post to the NIH subreddit, and it was this, I guess it was a scientist. They were like, does anyone know if we can go back to the lab to finish our experiments like in this current time? And I was like, I read that, and honestly, I I love scientists and science. So I've spent some time at the NIH, and I was like, oh, that's so public servanty, self-sacrificing of this person. But I think it's really sad what's happening. Like Donald Trump just loves firing people, and he really is just doing what he loves and firing people. And I'm really concerned as a citizen and as someone that has worked in the legislative branch as you have. I guess you've worked in both. You haven't worked in the Supreme Judicial branch, I guess, but the two branches. Um, isn't there like anything Congress can do about this? Or like Congress is the one that funds the NIH. So like it's hard to know what will happen, but do you
Mhm. Well, I think
they'll get their
well,
jobs back or anything?
yeah.
Or
So I think there's like several sort of like critical points that are going to be occurring, right? So the first is coming up in just a few weeks, and that's March 14th. And March 14th, what happens is the continuing resolution which is funded the government, which got passed like I think around November, December, um, will expire. And so what that means is that as of March 14th, unless the budget passes, then the whole government will shut down, everything except for essential services. Now, the Republicans have done this before, and it has always led to bad electoral consequences because it's when the whole government shuts down that people realize, like, we need government to function, right? We want to go to a national park, and we can't go to the national park because there's no park rangers. We want to go and I don't know, get a passport because we need to go to another country. Can't do it because it's shut down and it's not essential services. So we work for a contractor. That contractor works for the federal government. So when the federal government comes down, then it's not only the federal employees who are not working, but the contractors who work on behalf of the federal government who lose their who where nothing has happened and no income is coming in. And uh, there was a shutdown during the Trump won. I can't remember how many weeks it lasted, but it was a fairly long shutdown as these things go. And it always leads to an election turnover in the midterms, right? So that's kind of one factor. So the question is, can the Republicans, because remember the Republicans control everything now, right? The House, the Senate, the White House, but they disagree among themselves. And so can they get together to actually pass a federal budget? And the big aspect that's coming up related to that is increasing the debt ceiling because President Trump, even though he's been firing all these workers, which is basically, I don't know, I think a number I saw this morning was like 2% of the federal government of the federal budget. Um, like even if you take like all the federal workers, I think it's like no more than 10% of the federal budget. Well, um, but he still wants to he wants to do two things. He says, "Oh, I want to give checks to everybody." So again, he's trying to bribe people to kind of make them happy, and I want to give tax breaks to the rich people. Like those are literally two things that he's talked about for the past couple of days. Okay, so all those cost money. So if you actually look at how much money the government has spent, more money was spent during the Trump administration than during Obama or Biden administrations. And that's generally true of Democratic presidents. Like the last president who had a surplus was Clinton, sort of going back that far. So Trump tried to avoid making a decision on this issue when they had the previous discussion on the continuing resolution by saying, hey, you guys make the decision, you put it, but it didn't work, right? Because there's some Republicans who have very strong feelings that that the United States should not go further into debt. And this is a key vote for them. So we're going to see those decisions all in the next couple of weeks. Well, will the debt ceiling be raised? Will the budget get passed? And that's all happening in the next month. And will the government shut down? Now, I talked to some folks when I was at the AAAS meeting, the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting, who follow budget issues. That's like their job. And they said, well, it'll probably be like a year-long CR to get into the next thing. Uh, I have less confidence than they do, right? I mean, the members, the congressional staff have agreed on a budget, but getting enough members of Congress to vote on the budget and agree to it, I just don't know if it's there. And some people, there's definitely some folks out there like, what is it, Marjorie Green? I can't remember. That they don't care about shutdowns, right? They don't. She's in a strong Republican district. She'll always get reelected, so she doesn't care. But where they lose people are in places like where I am in Pennsylvania, where like even the area that I live in, it kind of leans red. But um sometimes it votes Democratic, sometimes it votes Republican. You sort of never quite know. So if you're the member of Congress from my district in Pittsburgh, um, in the Pittsburgh suburbs, I should say, then your seat is definitely up for grabs, and that's why the election in 2 years of midterms, well, really less than 2 years at this point, like uh, that will be a big factor. Can the Republicans keep control of the House and the Senate when they're only like 2 or 3 seats away from losing control?
Well, I mean, if you ask me, and no one asked me, and I am lifelong Democrat, I don't think that people really um, like what's happening. Like, I personally don't like what's happening. I'm helping organize doing organizing my first political, I guess you could say political event, which is a nonpartisan rally on science. The Stand Up for Science 2025 is happening in all of the US on March 7th, and I'm the regional organizer for Oklahoma. And we just got our well, I probably shouldn't say too much about it, but I'm like lining up speakers and stuff, and I've reached out to state and local lawmakers, and there's a lot of people that are actually like people that don't work in the federal government that are concerned about what's going on with the federal workforce. And I'm very concerned about the politicization of the federal workforce because it's supposed to be, yeah, it's in the executive branch, but it's not supposed to be like directly serving. I mean, I don't know constitutionally whether it's really meant to serve the president or if it's just meant to do public service in the executive branch. And maybe the Supreme Court will end up deciding some of this, but it's such a mess in my mind. And a lot of people, I don't want my tax dollars going to this as someone that has actually pays a lot of taxes, freelancer taxes. But I think that the Democrats, one thing I was really impressed by when I was watching the RFK filibuster slash whatever debate was that basically all the Democrats got up there and started talking about how great science is and how important vaccines are and how bonkers this nomination was for HHS. But then I have like another part of me, and I'm trying to stay optimistic, is like, you know, making like if we really do need to meet the debt ceiling and not go into extreme amounts of debt, like maybe it's fine that we just laid off these people because like probably they will go get some better paying high paying jobs. Of course the government will have lost talent, which is actually the government's problem, is they don't pay a lot, so I feel like no one wants to work for them as much as like they could go work at like Facebook or Amazon or something and make a bunch more money. But like if they think they can do this, like I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt as a taxpayer and just be like, go ahead, do whatever you want to do. But then like it's really stressful to me checking the news every day. And I just watched the what's it called? The interview with Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and I was just like, this is not what I voted for, because I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I have voted for him in the past, but I in 2020, but I didn't vote for him this time. So now I'm like, I didn't vote for him. Probably 48% of the US didn't vote for him. I don't understand what he's doing with our government. I don't even know if he understands what he's doing with the government. But like, um, and everything is just so much more political. And I was like, uh, and scientists are kind of like they're kind of like a political bargaining chip in this, and that's really dangerous. So I'm trying to stay optimistic, but I personally am, uh, I don't, I don't think that I've really voted for this. But anyway, that's kind of, I am a Democrat, so that's probably what a Democrat you would expect a
Yeah,
Democrat to
exactly.
say.
I think yeah, this is I think where it's important for uh what I suggest people do is like when you're watching like news shows, for example, like I tend to watch, say, Morning Joe pretty much every morning on MSNBC, right? But what I also encourage people to do is watch and listen to political shows, podcasts that don't go with their political point of view. So go over to Fox News and sort of see what it is that they're saying, which I realize is hard to do, but it's the only way to understand an alternative political perspective. And if you actually, at least last I knew, looking at the poll data, the majority of people who voted for Trump, which is the majority of Americans, are happy with what he's doing. I mean, it's hard for us to see it, but from their perspective, that's why they voted him in. He's got solid support for what it is that he's doing. Now, we might not agree with it, but it is like for us, like the science engineers who laid off, which I think, I know, last I knew was 11, 15,000, something of that order. I think American Institute of Physics was trying to keep track of it. It's still, like I said, going back to what I said kind of at the beginning, it's still such a small portion of the population. It's still basically what we viewed as the elite, right? It's less than 1% of the population for sure, because the population of the United States is like 360 million, I think, something like that. And so um it's not our perspective, right? But from an American population perspective, the broader population with whom we do not interact as much as we probably should, um, they are pretty much fine with what he's doing. And that's why I encourage, like in sort of these LinkedIn newsletters and things, like I sent one out this morning, that it's very important to go local, right? So Oklahoma is a red state. And there's like one thing that you could do is say, okay, well, how many jobs are lost in Oklahoma because of Trump administration action, right?
That's what I'm trying to figure out in planning this event is like, are there any people like, I'm a former PTSD researcher, and the best PTSD research in the whole world happens at the VA Medical Center. And so I think my research niche is kind of being destroyed right now because, like, if those researchers get laid off, I don't know where
Mhm.
they're going to have the infrastructure to do research. I mean, they might even go to like a different country. It's kind of, but yeah, I've been trying to ask around and see like, has any federal employees been laid off? I've reached out to,
Mhm.
from our science march, I've reached out to our Representative Tom Cole, who actually is a very longstanding supporter of biomedical science, and I'm trying to get him to speak at our rally. Um, but there's definitely a lot of places where, even in a red state, like I'm Democrat, but there's a lot of things I agree on with like the
Mhm.
Republicans that are probably seventy
Right.
percent of our state.
Right. And that's what like when I teach workshops about how to interact with people with whom you disagree. And the key is to find commonalities, right? To find things that you do agree upon, as opposed to arguing about things that you're never going to agree upon. Like, let's just take vaccines. I don't think you're ever going to, like, the people who are anti-vaxxers, it's just pretty much a lost cause, no matter what it is. They're just going to do what it is they do. Some of them believe it's a fundamental right that whether for them to decide, as opposed to the nation decide whether or not their kid should get vaccines or not get vaccines. So you're just not going to disagree. You're not going to agree, right? But look for the things where you do agree, right? So it might be something, like PTSD for veterans. That's a good one, right? Most people care about veterans, right? I can't say Trump cares about veterans because he said a lot of negative things about veterans, but your average Oklahoman, probably the Republican members of Congress, both the senators and the people, folks in the House, they probably care about that issue, right? So that's where you try to focus is on, well, okay, these are how many, there's this whole veteran center, I'm just making this up, in Oklahoma that focuses on PTSD. It employs 50 people, but because and it's very hard for them to find people who have this expertise. But because of the probationary thing where Trump fired all the probationary people, they are now 5 less people, 10% of the workforce, which is about what it is in some of these places. Okay, well, then the next step is to go talk to those 5 people and say, what did you do in your work for veterans? They tell their stories. You collect those stories and you provide those, in like an op-ed or something in your local newspaper, right? And wherever people get the news in your community. Um, those are the ones that where you have an event, you have those people speak. Because generally speaking, having scientists speak at the event, you know, is not going to work. But if you have just say the veterans who have PTSD who said, hey, because of this, I visited somebody, I don't know, let's just say once a week to help me with my PTSD. But because of this, I can now only visit somebody like every 2 months. And this has led me to have more suicidal thoughts or whatever it is, right? So the key is to have them tell their stories, the people who are impacted by these, whether it's the federal employees who lose their job, the people that were working with those federal workers at the veterans hospitals. You want to kind of get that story. And the example I put in my newsletter this morning was of I thought was a really good example of this. It was in Georgia, right? So like I said, Georgia, home of the CDC. And uh, one of the Republican members of Congress had his town meeting, right? Because members of Congress come to their home districts, every like month or so, to interact with the voters, right? To, keep that connection. So the first thing is a lot of people were at this town hall meeting. It wasn't like, like you never know how many people you get in this thing. There was if you look at the news clip, which is on NBC, um, you'll see that somebody has a question like, this is not basically saying, hey, this is not what I voted for. I did not vote for these things, right? And what was important is not only that he asked a question and that the member of Congress did not have a very good answer, but that when he gave the answer, because it was considered to have incorrect information in it, the rest of the crowd booed him. Now, that's the worst thing that you want as a member of Congress, is to get booed by what is a regular audience, right? It's not a group of scientists, engineers who are sitting in that room. It's your general population. So just the fact that you have that many people can, politicians, they can read the room, and it is clear when you watch this videotape, which was done by somebody from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is the big newspaper there. He was really having a challenge. And so if you're that member of Congress, you get worried, okay, well, am I going to get reelected in a year and a half? And the answer, unless he does something or takes a stand that says, hey, CDC is important to the nation, don't cut the workers at CDC, is that he might well lose the election. But that's me. It's so important with these members of Congress. They're the only ones who can do anything, right? Even with the courts have overturned this stuff, but they have no enforcement power, right? So the only way that you can stop the Trump-Musk debacle is to get Republican members of Congress to stand up. And it doesn't have to be a lot of them, and say, hey, this is wrong. And as we get into the budget season where all those discussions are going to occur, we're going to see a lot more of that, and we'll see how much these members of Congress are going to be able to stand up to their constituents. And It's a point whether or not you're represented by a Republican or Democrat, it doesn't make any difference. But there's I think it was in maybe the New York Times or Washington Post, I can't remember. There's an article about the degree to which these offices are being inundated with calls, like going from like 10, like 1,000 calls like a minute to like 10,000 calls a minute. I mean, some ridiculous number. Um, and but like I said, the home district stuff makes so much more difference. I think people think the opposite. They think, oh, well, meeting with my member of Congress in Washington. But no, it's a home district because that gets on the local news channels, right? That's where people, that's what people watch. They don't read the Washington Post or the New York Times. But what they do watch is at least they watch the news to get their weather. Right? And then part of it is seeing the headlines. And the headlines that they had in Atlanta was Congressman so and so getting booed because of the layoffs at CDC, and that's what's making the headlines in that region of the country today. And also then it went national.
Well, what would really make me happy as a person with a science background is to see voters vote these people out of office for voting, and as a Democrat, these people like voting their representatives out of office over this. Like, I think that for the RFK confirmation, it was the Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, who is on an important health committee, and he was the deciding vote for that one. And he voted yes for RFK, even though he disagreed with RFK, because Donald Trump threatened to primary him. And so I was like, well, if these people get voted out of office, which, you know, they might get voted out of office, but they're also delivering on the president's agenda. So, but I mean, it would be cool to see science be a voting issue in the next election, especially where we've gone from loving vaccines to hating vaccines to just moving beyond thinking about public health to maybe come back to like a slightly pro science consensus. I would make me very happy. But that starts with, I think it's actually very hard to get people to care about this issue and think about this issue, and people will just believe. I mean, they won't believe, but like if you look at like I check what our lawmakers are tweeting every day, like in the Senate, and some of it is the Republicans have actually not tweeted about the science necessarily. They've just sort of aligned with President Trump's agenda so that they won't get primaried. But the Democrats are, some of them are tweeting about science like all the time, about vaccines, about firing the NIH workers. Someone tweeted about firing I think Senator Patty Murray tweeted about firing the VA workers. And I was like, wow, preach. That's like my personal interest. And I wonder if other people care, if regular people that aren't scientists like care about this issue, if they even know about it, if they know that like every dollar the NIH gets gives them like X amount of cures that you can't really measure with money. I feel like that's what scientists and lawmakers that want to combat this narrative. I think that we have to start talking about like what we really benefit from science research. And I think it's going to be difficult to figure out because we don't really have scientists in our communications departments of policymakers. So, anyway, we could probably talk about that forever. And it's an interesting conversation. And I'm every day for the rest of the Trump administration, we're going to have to see where this goes. But so, what are you working on in the science policy space these days?
Yeah, no, I'm afraid this is going to be my last question because I need to move on to something else. But um, yeah, so my focus, I have sort of like a couple of focuses right now. So, I have multiple hats. So first, I'm a consultant, so I do things like do analysis, collect data. I help people develop proposals that are going to relate to economic development in their communities. So right now I'm doing activities related to quantum and the intersection of quantum and material science research and manufacturing. So it's been fun for me to do that as kind of a new field. Like, I mean, I've particularly worked in manufacturing for quite a while, and I've known about quantum, but I haven't really focused on the intersection of the two. So on the scientific side, that's what I do. On the policy side, there's kind of several things that I'm sort of focused on. The first is I'm just calling it like people first. So I have not been particularly happy with how some of our national science and technology policy leaders are responding to the Trump administration. I think that they are uh, taking preemptive action as opposed to sort of the right action. They're taking, by that I mean they're taking action because they think by taking it they'll avoid getting in trouble with the Trump administration, and that might impact their funding. And I just don't think that's the way that our leaders should focus. I don't think they should focus only on the funding of research, um, that, the money that would be lost through loss of overhead. All that is important, of course, but I don't think that they're focusing enough on the people of the science technology policy community, not only the federal workers, but also the people like when they, in the process of closing down USAID, all the people around the world, the people who work for nonprofits and other organizations who are trying to provide vaccines and provide food and respond to environmental issues like clean water and so forth. And I just have felt that most of the leadership is not taking a leading role. There was an article just this morning for the National Academy of Sciences and Medicine that I used to work for, talking about they already um, and this is an organization I have always been very proud to work for. Like I said, I was there for 18 years. And they closed the DEI office that they at one point were very proud to stand up. They are now, it seems, according to the stat article, there was like about 100 members of the academy who wrote protesting, changing the reports, the language of reports that have already been, like that are in the process of review to remove DEI language at the National Academies, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I felt that they, and I think a lot of people who were there felt that it was out of tune. Their focus was so much on, okay, more funding for research and the benefits of research, that they lose track of the people who are actually doing that research, and that are not necessarily even do that research, but are serving in our federal government. And I don't think that they are doing enough to support those individuals. It's only a very small number of the science technology organizations that are offering things like career guidance and counseling and all the things to support that. And so I call that sort of people first. That rather than it should be funding first, there's only so much we can do about funding. But there's things all these organizations could do today to help the people, so forth. So that's sort of like one um, element that I'm focusing on. And the other aspect of it, and so I do like a newsletter, I named after my book, um, which talks about this every week. So for the past like every week I've written something. I call it Trump Chaos Week 1, Week 2, Week 3, just trying to catalog all the things that are happening, and also highlighting the people who are doing good things, because there are a lot of people in the community who are trying to help these workers who have lost their positions, and the nonprofits who have lost their funding, and so forth. And then the other aspect is I have another news, and both of these newsletters, by the way, were started like I don't know about 6 months ago, before we knew Trump was going to be reelected. One has science technology policy job openings in it. And that's because I think most scientists, engineers do not understand the wide array of science technology policy jobs available to them. They sort of think that the only way they can impact policy is, by congressional fellowship or, White House internship, things like that. But, there's when you're thinking about not just policy for science technology, which focus on research, instead about science technology for policy, which is how we can improve, we can make society better through scientific and technical information, that is often neglected. So part of this reason for this newsletter, and like this week, I think we have 150 like postings. Last week we had 180 postings, which is still a drop in the bucket compared to the thousands who lost their job. But I think it offers hope that there are people even if you're DEI, even if you're working on international issues, um, where you can still kind of fight the fight for society, to make society better. And so it's sort of with those two newsletters, that's what I'm trying to really kind of make my impact through it. And so, I mean, if anybody's interested in the free newsletters, if you go to my LinkedIn profile, then you'll see how you can sign up for those newsletters.
Yeah, and I just read the one you posted today. Well, I skimmed it and I thought, wow, that's going to be great for everyone that just lost their job or is kind of in legal battles about their job right now. So I think that's a really great resource for everyone. And we'll link everything, your Science and Technology Policy Academy, and also your LinkedIn in the description box so people can check it out. Thanks for your time, Dr. Stine. It's cool to meet someone that worked in the Obama OSTP that I tried to work in. And
Well, it could have been, since I don't remember interviewing myself, it was probably after I left, because Obama was in office for 8 years and I was only there for the first three. So,
I think it might have been, I'm not sure what year it was. I want to say it was 2000, maybe 2010 or so. I don't remember what year he got into office, but it was, I kind of just like applied. I actually interviewed with Michael Stebbins, who I recently connected with on LinkedIn because Mark Bayer interviewed both me and him for his podcast, When Science Speaks. I don't know if you've heard Mark Bayer's podcast, but it's one of my favorite podcasts too. But yeah, it's cool connecting with Obama, and I met some Obama people because back then the Brain Initiative was everything, and I'm a neuroscientist, so I I really loved that time. But anyway, thanks for your time and taking the time to chat with me. And it's definitely, you give me a lot of things to think about. And I'm grateful for your time. And we'll make sure to link everything so everyone can check out everything you're doing.
great. Well, thank you very much.